The NHL season has been over for a few days now, and to help get over the sadness, we are going to look back at this past season and talk about some of the best games from the 2021-2022 Dallas Stars season. We'll cover three of the biggest games on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
You're Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Dallas Stars media, coming to you on this Thursday, June 30th. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener of the show, thank you for stopping by and making us your first listen every single day. Be sure to subscribe to our show on YouTube. The road to 500 subscribers continues on. You can also follow us on your favorite podcasting platform. Best way to help the show is by either leaving a comment on YouTube, liking the video, or leaving us a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple. Thank you guys for continuing to tune in, and we are now a few days removed from the final game of the 21-22 NHL season. The Stanley Cup Finals are over. We're kind of now in this limbo period of waiting for the draft next week and waiting for free agency to open up, waiting for big trades to go down. Although a few hours before recording this episode, the Kevin Fiala news did break that he will be heading to Los Angeles to play for the Kings. So that's kind of the first of many dominoes that will fall this offseason of players going to different cities and playing for different teams. But we are here to get ourselves over the sadness of no NHL hockey for the next few months, and wanted to take a look back at some of the best games for the Dallas Stars this past season. Figured it'd be good for myself and likely good and fun for you guys to go back down memory lane. And gonna start this off by cheating a little bit, because my first game of the year is actually 3 games of the year, because every chapter in this saga between these two teams was absolutely epic this season. And of course, I'm talking about the matchups between the Dallas Stars and their division rival, the Winnipeg Jets. And really, I'm talking about the last 3 games of this season series, although game 1 was an exciting and thrilling game in its own right. However, the Dallas Stars did lose 4-3 in a shootout in that game, but the 3 games that would follow that one would have the Dallas Stars as victors, and all of them would require extra hockey, and they were all just some of the best games of the season and exactly what you want in a division matchup where you play a team 3 or 4 times a season. You want to have games like this, and all 3 of these games brought the action every single time. You start with Friday, February 11th. This was the Jamie Benn Gordie Howe hat trick game. He scored a big goal in the third that would have been the go-ahead goal. He got an assist on a Tyler Sagan goal earlier in the game, and then, of course, he got into a fight with Brendan Dillon at one point in the matchup, of course, securing him the Gordie Howe hat trick. But that would not be the biggest moment of the game. The biggest moment of the game would come in overtime when Jason Robertson, remember his name because he is a key player in several of these matchups against the Jets, would go on to score the game-winning goal in overtime on a play that could not have happened without all 3 Stars players on the ice. Roope Hintz actually stole the puck from the Jets, who were looking to start a breakaway. He prevents the breakaway and then gives a man advantage opportunity for the Stars. He passes the puck to John Klingberg, and then John Klingberg finds a cutting Jason Robertson. Robo shoots the puck. It gets blocked by Connor Hellebuck. And then Robo stays with his shot and gets the rebound essentially and sends the puck into the back of the net, giving the Stars a thrilling overtime win that sent the Friday night Dallas Stars fandom into an absolute frenzy. I had the privilege of being at that game up in the box, and it was just absolutely electric in that building. But it wouldn't stop there, because less than 2 weeks later, the Stars and Jets would match up again at the AAC on Wednesday, February 23rd. Jamie Benn scored in this game shorthanded, and Denis Gurianov, who will also be a key player later in the sequence of games, scored a incredibly clutch game-time goal with under 10 minutes left to play. And then, of course, this game remembered for, again, going into overtime. But Tyler Sagan getting the game-winning goal pretty early in the OT period, but it was one of the oddest goals that you'll ever see. And I don't think too many people thought it was a goal initially, except maybe Tyler Sagan and his other Stars teammates on the ice. It was a weird play where Sagan was kind of coming at the net, shot the puck. It actually was blocked by Connor Hellebuck on his arm pad, bounces up in the air, but Tyler Sagan stays with it and basically kind of tips it in with his stick up in the air. And then the puck falls down and just barely crosses the red line past the crease into the net before it was eventually cleared. I can't remember which Jets player cleared it, but in a bang-bang situation in real time, it looked like it was cleared, that it was close, but not quite a goal. But then replay review from the officials would go on to show that it was a good goal, and the Dallas Stars secured the win. But quite possibly the most thrilling matchup of this entire trilogy, of this entire season series, came in Winnipeg on Friday, March 4th. And this is, of course, the Jason Robertson game. He had the hat trick. He had the game-winning goal after a shift that lasted 1 minute and 37 seconds, an unassisted game-winning goal for the win, obviously, to give the Stars a massive 2 points in the later stages of the season when every point mattered. And then, of course, doing it without really the help of another Stars player, beating out 2 Winnipeg Jets skaters, and then, of course, beating Connor Hellebuck, who's one of the better goalies in the NHL. And he just collapses to the ground as his teammates mob him while he's laying there because he's absolutely exhausted. But not to be overlooked, also in this game, Denis Gurianov, yet another clutch game-tying goal late in the third period to force overtime. And then, of course, Jason Robertson would take care of the rest. And he would go on to have another big hat trick game later that weekend that we'll cover a little bit later in the show. Well, coming up next, we will talk about the next big game. This one was one of the final games of the season. It had a ton of anticipation building around it, and it delivered in just about every asset of the game. We'll talk about it after a quick break. Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news this season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and more. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline.net, where the game starts. All right, we're moving on this Thursday episode of Locked On Stars, reviewing some of the best games of the Dallas Stars 2021-2022 season. This is your host, Dane Lewis. Thank you again for making us your first listen every single day. And we are moving on to, like I said at the end of the last segment, one of the best games of the season for the Stars came in the third to last game of the season. This was a game that had a ton of anticipation building around it, really kind of since the month of April started. This is, of course, the Dallas Stars versus Vegas Golden Knights in Dallas. Both of these teams duking it out for a wild card spot in the Western Conference playoffs. The Golden Knights came into the season as favorites to win the Pacific Division, but quickly, due to injuries and the emergence of some other really good, talented squads in that Pacific Division, found themselves on the outside looking in of a playoff picture, with Calgary taking over sole control of the division. The Edmonton Oilers, of course, led by Draisaitl and McDavid, and the LA Kings kind of coming out of nowhere to surprise a lot of people, taking that third place spot in that division. And Vegas was trying their hardest to at least get a wild card spot to compete to be in the Stanley Cup playoffs. And the Dallas Stars in a similar situation in a very crowded Central Division that was headlined by, of course, the now Stanley Cup champion Colorado Avalanche, but also some really talented, loaded offensive teams like the Minnesota Wild, St. Louis Blues, and the Nashville Predators, who eventually did make the playoffs along with the Stars. But this game just had a ton riding on it because the Stars and Golden Knights futures were still uncertain on the season, and Vegas seemed to have the upper hand, at least if you look at the track record from the season. Vegas already had a 2-0 record on the Stars this past season, winning in Dallas and winning a game in Vegas. Games that the Dallas Stars, when you look back at it, probably should have won. A blown lead very early in the season when they played at home, a game that eventually went to overtime, and the Stars losing in OT, and then a game in Vegas that went kind of back and forth. The Stars had plenty of opportunities to take advantage and take a commanding lead in that game, yet they failed to do so, and they collapsed late, losing to the Vegas Golden Knights in mid-December. A playoff spot was on the line. The Stars needed to defend home ice and get some revenge. This game had everything that you could want for a late regular season hockey game, about as big of a game as you could get at that point in the regular season. And Jason Robertson, who else would come up big for the Dallas Stars, scoring his 39th and 40th goal of the season, joining the 40-goal club. Two just fantastic goals, both in timing and helping the Stars, but also just beautiful highlights. Some of his best goals of the season. The first one, a beautiful stick handling job off a nice feed from Thomas Harley at the blue line in the second period to tie the game. You can just go back and watch him kind of dissect the defense on that play. It's absolutely beautiful to watch. Robertson, low-key, such a great player with the puck on his stick. And then, of course, he's got that really nice shot as well. And then the game-tying goal in the third period that would eventually force overtime was a great connection with John Klingberg. Robo just kind of sticks his stick out as he approaches the crease to give Klingberg a target. One of Klingberg's better plays of the season as well. And it bounces right off Robo's stick into the back of the net to tie the game. And then both teams would go back and forth exchanging shots at one another, but both goalies stood firm. And this was just one of those games that the moment was big and it kind of got to stay big without too much controversy. Only 8 penalty minutes in the game, although one of Vegas's goals was a power play goal by Chandler Stevenson. Really, this game was not marred by officiating or anything else like that, especially near the end of the game. Both teams just kind of got to play, and it made it really refreshing and made it really entertaining. And of course, you can't mention this game without talking about Jake Ottinger, who at this point had already been on fire for the majority of the late stages of the season, and he carried that into the final games of the regular season as well, saving 33 of 35 shots against the Golden Knights, and was absolutely electric in overtime and in the shootout period. And then, of course, Miro Heiskanen would go on to finally break the seal. Both goalies were absolutely lights out in the shootout, but Miro Heiskanen in the 7th round finally broke the ice and got the Stars the win. And this was a huge win in pushing the Stars towards the playoffs. They definitely needed a regulation win with the Vegas Golden Knights getting 0 points to actually clinch a playoff spot in that game. But nonetheless, the win and the 2 points made it much easier for Dallas to clinch that spot later with games against the Coyotes and Ducks to close out the year, whereas the Vegas Golden Knights had a little bit more of a tough schedule, and really the Dallas Stars just needed 1 point to get past it. They would get it in their next game against the Coyotes, and they would clinch a playoff spot. So although the ending wasn't quite as sweet as it could have been, it was still a really fun game, really entertaining, lots on the line. It lived up to the hype. The Stars got the win, got the revenge, and eventually did clinch that playoff spot and kept the Vegas Golden Knights out of the postseason, much to the rejoicing of many NHL fans and other teams across the league. I mean, that was just such a huge moment, incredibly fun to watch, and incredibly fun to watch the fans kind of, gather around this team and watch them and help push them to the playoffs. I do believe, what makes the Stars so great is that home ice advantage. And I think the Vegas Golden Knights kind of succumbed to the pressure of playing in that moment in front of all those fans. And then, of course, the Dallas Stars just rose to the occasion in that moment. And it was truly incredible to see. Well, coming up next, we will talk about some honorable mentions for the best Dallas Stars game of the season. And then, of course, give the final and quite possibly the best game that we saw from the Dallas Stars all season. Coming up after another quick break. All right, we're closing out today's episode of Locked On Stars. We're talking about the best games of the 2021-2022 season. And before we talk about the game that I really want to take a deep dive into, I should have said before, none of these are really ranked in order. Of course, I've already talked about 4 games, even though technically, Stars versus Jets, you could really just put any of those games I talked about in a category of their own. But none of these really ranked, although I don't know, this next game I'm going to talk about might have been the best one of the season as far as entertainment. But before we dive into it, let's talk about some honorable mentions. October 14th, opening night at Madison Square Garden against the New York Rangers. That was a fantastic game. Jacob Peterson scores the first goal of the season for the Stars, his first career goal in the NHL. Miro Heiskanen gets the overtime game winner. Got to talk about the home opener on October 22nd against the LA Kings. Denis Gurianov plays hero and sends the Stars and their fans home happy on opening night. November 30th against the Carolina Hurricanes at home. Braden Holtby just went ballistic in that game. That was in the middle of that 7-game win streak in late November, early December. And Rope Hintz did notch the hat trick in that game. He played out of his mind. February 15th at the Colorado Avalanche, mainly just throwing this in there because we did beat the Stanley Cup champions in Denver and actually won the season series against them. Jake Ottinger was lights out in that 4-1 game. Really, really nice bounce back win after they had been beat, I believe, and even shut out at home against the Avalanche just a few days before. So a really nice bounce back win there and one of the better performances by Ottinger this season. Sunday, March 6th at the Minnesota Wild, Jason Robertson gets another hat trick. That was a game that was on TNT, a really fun division rival game between the Stars and Minnesota Wild. March 22nd against the Edmonton Oilers, that was a big comeback win to get Dallas 2 points while they were still pushing for a playoff spot. March 24th against the Carolina Hurricanes, Scott Wedgwood's debut with the Dallas Stars and another fantastic outing from Rope Hintz to help secure the win for Dallas while, again, they were pushing for a playoff spot. And then, of course, April 12th, the 1-0 win against the Tampa Bay Lightning. Another really gifted team, a team that made it to the Stanley Cup Finals, and Dallas shut them out and beat them on home ice in one of the more exciting 1-0 games that you'll ever witness. But the game that I think should be up there for potentially the best and most entertaining, most electric Dallas Stars game of the 2021-2022 regular season was, of course, on Thursday, January 6th, Dallas Stars versus the Florida Panthers. Just even setting the stage for this game, it was, so much was going into this, another game that had a lot of hype around it, but for a very different reason. 2022 obviously had just begun 6 days into the new year, and the Dallas Stars were playing their first game since December 20th of the previous year. The NHL had kind of gone on lockdown, being shut down due to a big COVID-19 outbreak. Several teams off for several weeks through Christmas and even through the early days of January. So the NHL was finally starting to come back into our lives. It seemed like we were going to be able to finish out the regular season and have teams make up their lost games during what would have been the Olympic break. And so a lot of nerves going into this game, a lot of, okay, which teams are legit and which teams are going to start to fade away after this break. And this game between the offensive juggernaut Florida Panthers and the home team Dallas Stars was all you could have asked it to be. And I wish I could have been at this game, but even just watching it on TV was exciting enough. I mean, there were 10 goals total in regulation, 6 of them coming in the second period. 5 different Dallas Stars scored goals. I mean, it was just a big effort from just about everybody on the team. This was a back and forth game for the entire runtime, even into overtime. This is another game that required extra hockey with a shootout. And just everybody came to play on both sides, and it was evident from the first puck drop up until the very end. These guys were ready to get back out there on the ice, and the energy was just unmatched in the building, from the fans to the players to the coaches. Everyone was buzzing that night, and it was just very evident and gave us one of the better games of the regular season. The Dallas Stars looked like they had the win in the bag, but then Jonathan Huberdeau came and tied the game in the final waning seconds of the third period. So a lot of nerves going into that overtime, because this Florida Panthers team, as we all know, was just a absolute offensive threat in the regular season. They could score from pretty much anywhere with anyone at any time. But the Stars were able to win in the shootout behind Jason Robertson's heroics. Joe Pavelski also scored a goal in that shootout. And then Braden Holtby was actually still getting significant play time as goalie at this point in the season. He saved 37 of 42 shots and stopped Jonathan Huberdeau and Anton Lundell in the shootout to help give the Stars the win, to send the home fans back home happy, and to give the Stars a big W coming out of that long COVID pause. And then they would actually go on to win the next game in pretty dramatic fashion at home against the Pittsburgh Penguins as well. You probably count both games against Pittsburgh as honorable mentions too, with, of course, the aforementioned game at home, and then even the 4th game of the season. The Stars beat the Penguins in a shootout in Pittsburgh. That was an exciting one too, but so many great games this past season. If you're watching on YouTube, let me know in the comments down below what your favorite game was from the Dallas Stars this past season. I'm sure that I missed one game that had an exciting moment or an exciting ending while talking about these games. So I would love to hear your thoughts again in the comments down below. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked on Stars. Thank you guys so much for stopping in and for making us your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to our show on YouTube as well as on your favorite podcasting platform. We are free and available no matter where or how you listen. You can also find and follow me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis and our show as well at Locked on Stars. Be sure to tune in tomorrow as Sam Nestler, friend of the show who writes about the Dallas Stars, will be joining me, and we'll just be chatting about this team heading into draft week and what our thoughts could potentially be as far as trades and free agency go. You won't want to miss it. It's going to be a fantastic conversation. Thank you again for listening, Stars fans. We'll see you back here tomorrow.